Welcome to the seminar, Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles. I'm James Foster, co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, in the Elliott School of International Affairs of the George Washington University. I'm here with my colleague and co-author, Sabina Alkire, director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, in Oxford's Department of International Development. Thanks for joining us for today's talk, Multidimensional Poverty and Inclusive Growth in India, an analysis using growth elasticities, presented by my former student, Suman Seth of Leeds University. Suman has been a part of this conversation for as long as anyone, having been an RA on the Alkire Foster paper, a major contributor to the 2010 HDR with a new measure of gender inequality, and a key member of the OPHI team at Oxford. We're really happy to have you here today, Suman. This is the 8th in a series of that is co-sponsored by IIEP, OPHI, and the Human Development Report Office, or HDRO, of the United Nations Development Program. I'd like to express my appreciation to these partners and to the many benefactors of IIEP for continued support that makes events like these possible. The discussant today is IIEP's very own distinguished visiting scholar, Ajay Chhibber, who was when the global MPI was first released in 2010, he was Assistant Secretary General at the UN and Assistant Administrator of UNDP. Bios of both of our speakers are in the program that you received. Before proceeding, I'd like to say a few words about our institute. IIEP supports research, enhances teaching and learning, and convenes nonpartisan discussions of the key questions facing the international community. Last week on Friday in our China conference, Meg Rithmeyer of Harvard Business School presented China's Outward Investments, State Capitalism or State Flight. Tomorrow at 10 Eastern, Dr. Ibrahim Asani Mayaki, head of the Africa Union's new Partnership for Africa's Development, or NEPAD, and former Prime Minister of Niger, will present Africa After COVID-19, Charting a New Course for Economic Growth. The following day, Wednesday at 9, IIEP welcomes N.K. Singh, chair of the 15th Finance Commission of India, who will discuss India's federal finances in COVID times, with commentary by Junaid Ahmad and Indira Rajaraman. If you miss any of our events, you can watch them asynchronously on our YouTube channel, IIEPGW. The present series brings global scholars together to discuss the problem of global poverty, viewed multidimensionally. Last week, my former student, Mariama Santos, presented her paper, Inequality Among the Multidimensionally Poor in Over 100 Countries. Next week, we're going to take a week off for our GW spring break, but we'll resume soon afterwards. Keep a lookout. So, without further ado, let me turn everything over to Suman Seth for today's talk. Suman?
Thank you very much, Professor Foster, and I also thank my colleagues at OPHI and IIEP for organizing the event, and thank you very much for giving me a chance to present our work. Let me share my screen. So this is my topic is multidimensional poverty and inclusive growth in India, an analysis using growth elasticities, and it's a co-authored paper with my colleague Sabina Alkire. Now, to a bit of background of this particular project. So I and Sabina, during my time at OPHI, we were working on multidimensional poverty reduction in India between 1998 and 2005-6. And we published the paper afterwards in World Development in 2015. And at that time, Professor Foster was also leading a project with the Asian Development Bank about the social indicators in the South Asian region. And so that's how we sort of started working on this paper around 2014. And in the first draft, we analyzed the period between 1998 and 2005-06. And then recently, with Sabina Alkire, Christian Oldiges, and Usha Kanagaratnam, they analyzed again the multidimensional poverty reduction for the period between 2005-06 and 2015-16. And the paper has also been published in World Development. So we took the opportunity to revise the estimates of our paper for the more recent period between 2005-06 and 2015-16. So to this crowd, I guess, it is not hard to motivate about the need for looking at dimensions or indicators beyond the monetary aspect. If we look at India's economic growth performance, it has been during the period of, say, last 17, 18 years of these new millennia, India's economic growth, which is the growth of per capita GDP, has been much higher than several South Asian neighbors. Yet there has been debate about that the key social indicators have not been relatively satisfactory, whether it is the health of maternal health or child health, or access to basic resources, say in rural areas, in slum areas. They have not been relatively satisfactory. If we compare with India's neighboring countries such as Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, in several of these indicators, India has been lagging behind and the progress has been much slower. And this has been acknowledged in the literature in these decades and also in the previous decade. In this paper, what we do, we examine the inclusiveness of economic growth to multidimensional poverty reduction between the period 2005-06 and 2015-16. Just to clarify upfront that we are not claiming any causal relationship between economic growth and multidimensional poverty reduction. What we do in this paper simply explore the relationship, link, or association between these two during the same period. And for this purpose, we use a number of elasticity and semi-elasticity measures, and I will discuss about those concepts soon. And I borrow heavily from one of James Foster's 2014 paper. It's similar name, it's Inclusive Growth and Elasticities to study the link between growth and multidimensional poverty. And for the concept of semi-elasticity, I borrow from Klassen and Misselhorn 2008. I will introduce these concepts soon. To capture multidimensional poverty, I use the well-known Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, which you may have heard several times in the previous seminars of this series, and which is an adaptation of the adjusted headcount ratio developed by Alkire and Foster. And our study especially is based on the findings or the estimates of Alkire, Oldiges, and Kanagaratnam 2021 article that has been published in World Development recently. Now, just to give you a brief glimpse of the literature, so literature on multidimensional poverty on India has there has been several articles over the last decade studying multidimensional poverty in India. Most of these studies use various rounds of demographic health surveys. In India, it is called National Family Health Survey. And some also, like Mitra 2018, also try to adapt the national NSS, National Sample Survey, which is India's flagship consumer expenditure survey. In our previous work, which is Alkire in 2015, we observed that the multidimensional poverty reduction in India between the period of 1998 and 2005-6 was not very inclusive in that sense. The reduction for the poorest subgroups, whether they were subnational regions, poorer castes, poorer religious groups, they were slower. They improved, they reduced poverty slower in absolute term. Okay. However, that trend has been reversed in the next study period, which is 2005-6 and 2015-16, as found by Alkire, Oldikes, and Kanagaratnam. Now, in order to study growth elasticity, that means the link between economic growth and poverty reduction, mainly two approaches can be used. One is the regression-based approach to look at the relationship between economic growth and poverty. And the other one is a point elasticity-based approach. In regression-based approach, we have all the regions together in one regression, and mainly the regression-based approach study cross-country or cross-regional variation due to economic growth. Or cross-regional variation in poverty due to economic growth. Point-based elasticity, on the other hand, look at each region in the country, with a lens, and look at how each region has responded to its economic growth in terms of reducing poverty. So we use that particular approach because we are interested in looking at various geographic subnational decompositions, as well as decompositions within measures, and I will explain to you as we progress. So we fill the gap by looking at the relationship between economic growth and multidimensional poverty in India, which has not been studied properly using the point elasticity approach. Very briefly, again, probably these audience may already know the concept of the multidimensional, or the methodology of multidimensional poverty index, but I'm still taking an opportunity to talk about it very briefly. So the global MPI was developed in 2010 by OPHI and the United Nations Development Program. The Multidimensional Poverty Index consists of 10 indicators, and it has several useful properties. The first one is that the MPI, the overall index, can be broken down into multidimensional headcount ratio, is the incidence of multidimensional poverty, or the proportion of poor people, multidimensionally poor population, and the average deprivation score among the poor, which is, if you focus on the poor population on an average, how much deprivations they face on an average. So MPI is a product of these two important components. Another feature of the MPI, or the adjusted headcount ratio overall, is that the overall index can be computed as population weighted sum of subgroup MPIs. In this case, we will be doing subnational analysis. So the overall MPI can be expressed or can be computed as population weighted sum of subnational MPIs. And we will I will try to show that how it is useful for an inclusive, horizontal inclusive growth analysis. Come to that. Also, the MPI can be broken down into dimensional weighted average of so-called censored headcount ratios. Censored headcount ratio for a particular dimension is the proportion of multidimensionally poor. They are also deprived in that particular indicator. Uncensored headcount ratio, on the other hand, denotes the proportion of population deprived in an indicator, irrespective of deprivations in other indicators. Weights, of course, sum to they are positive, and they sum to 1. So this is the multidimensional measurement methodology that we'll be making our analysis based on. Now, let me introduce the concept of elasticity and semi-elasticity. What do you mean by elasticity? Elasticity is the percentage, it's a measure which assesses the percentage change in an nth variable, which say we refer to as x, associated with a 1% change in a means variable, which is y, between two periods. So our x variable here, for example, could be the multidimensional poverty index, and our y variable could be growth. So in that sense, we could say that percentage change in a percentage reduction in MPI due to 1% change in per capita income or 1% economic growth. And technically, it is written, we'll be using the term E to refer to, we'll be using E to refer to the elasticity. So between X and Y, it's written by percentage change in X divided by percentage change in Y. And this change for this particular paper, we have annualized these changes. Similarly, when we look at semi-elasticity, semi-elasticity is, instead of this percentage change is a relative change. Semi-elasticity says that requires that it is an absolute change. It knows an absolute change in an nth variable x associated with a 1% change in the mean variable y. So because of 1% economic growth, how much poverty has been reduced in absolute term? And what do you mean by absolute term? We mean absolute change, which is the difference between the two variables divided by the time duration. Again, you can see they both are annualized, these measures that we use in this paper. For our data analysis, our estimates that we borrow from Alkire, Oldikis, and Kanagaratnam, they are based on 2 rounds of National Family Health Survey datasets, NFHS 3 and NFHS 4. They are also known as, they are also the Demographic Health Survey dataset. For the economic growth of national economic growth or the state domestic product, state economic growth, we get the data from the 2014-15 and 2018-19 Handbook of Statistics on Indian economy. Now, first we consider vertical inclusiveness. By vertical inclusiveness, we refer to here that how much of the economic growth has just reduced poverty really. So in terms of national vertical inclusiveness, we mean that how much of the national economic growth has been associated with a reduction in national MPI and its partial indicators. Or if we want to focus on a particular state, it would be how much of the state growth has or is related, has been related to a reduction in that state's MPI, okay? Which is different from what is referred to as horizontal inclusiveness, which means how much of the national growth has translated into state reduction. So we are not linking it now. We are looking at national versus national figures and state versus state figures. So for semi-elasticity, we use the formulation or use these terms: national growth semi-elasticity of national MPI and state growth semi-elasticity of state MPI, which is given by change, absolute change in national MPI divided by 1% absolute growth, and percentage change in a state's or subnational MPI due to subnational, that state's economic growth. Similarly, elasticity could be defined as national growth elasticity could be percentage change in MPI due to percentage growth, and for state growth elasticity, percentage change in state MPI by percentage state growth. So what do we observe nationally when we present the figures together? So here in the first row, I present the computations of multidimensional poverty index. The global MPI for India has fallen from 0.283 to 0.123, which is equivalent to an annualized absolute change of 0.016 points. In terms of annual relative change, this is 8% reduction per annum. And similarly, if we look at per capita net national product, the national figures, it has increased by 6% per annum. So there has been a growth of 6% per annum between these periods. So if we look at the growth semi-elasticity, the figure that we get is 0.0027. Given that MPI lies between 0 and 1, these particular figures appears to be too low, but how should we read that? That 1% of national economic growth is associated with 0.0027 units of MPI reduction per year. Okay. If we look at growth elasticity, we say that 1% of economic growth is related to 1.3% MPI reduction during this period. So it looks like that annual relative reduction in MPI has been slightly faster than the economic growth in relative sense, but we should have a note of caution because one is sort of an unbounded indicator, whereas the other is MPI is a bounded indicator. If we look at two components of MPI, which is incidence and intensity, you can clearly see the absolute reduction in incidence has been 2.7 percentage point per year, or a 6.6% reduction in relative sense. For intensity, the reduction has been 0.74 percentage point per year, or 1.54% over this period. Now, of course, the first question you may ask is how does it fare with or compare with income poverty reduction? So here, this table presents $1.9 a day, World Bank's $1.9 a day poverty reduction between the year 2004-05 and 2011-12. Somewhat comparable, not fully comparable. And the reduction, comparable reduction should be the reduction in incidence with the incidence of reduction. This is incidence of multidimensional poverty, and this is incidence of $0.19 a day. You can see in terms of absolute reduction, this reduction has been slightly slower. So the elasticity, growth semi-elasticity is slightly smaller for income poverty than the incidence of multidimensional poverty. But in terms of relative reduction, the growth elasticity, which is related to annualized relative change, is higher than the incidence of multidimensional poverty reduction. So growth semi-elasticity has been slower, but growth elasticity has been faster, mainly because to start with, the incidence of monetary poverty has been much lower than the incidence of multidimensional poverty. Then we look at absolute reduction in MPI and growth across states. So we look at each state's annual per capita income growth with each state's MPI poverty reduction. First, we look at the absolute poverty reduction. On the vertical axis, it is thus the absolute change in subnational MPI. We also put national figure, so that's why here. So we just say change in MPI or change in MPI-M. And on the vertical axis, of course, change is the economic growth of different states. And just for reference point, we put the national level figures in the middle. You can see that although the slope looks positive here, it is not statistically significantly positive. Okay, so we cannot say that there has been sort of a positive relationship or a negative relationship between annual growth in per capita income and annualized absolute reduction in MPI. What if we, before we go, let's look at sort of the state ranks. So this is the national line, which should be the national absolute change or state growth, national growth semi-elasticity, actually, this blue line. And you can see on the left are those states that have performed slower in terms of reducing MPI in absolute sense relative to its economic growth. And on the other hand, on the right side of India, there are states that have with faster growth semi-elasticity. So here you can see states which have reduced, sort of led to slower absolute reduction would be Delhi, Kerala, Mizoram, Gujarat, Uttarakhand, and on the right side there are Uttar Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, Arunachal Pradesh, West Bengal, Jharkhand, and Meghalaya. These are the states which have much faster reduction in absolute poverty. However, we have to note that MPI is bounded in a sense that if states like Delhi and Kerala, which had much slower multidimensional poverty to start with anyway, they did not have much opportunity to lead to a larger reduction anyway. If MPI is say 0.05, you cannot have a reduction of 0.3, for example. So we should also look at the relative reduction in MPI and compare it to analyzed growth. When we look at that, then we present percentage change in MPI on the vertical axis and percentage change in economic growth. Then we observe a negative relationship that is statistically significant based on the data, which means that states that had much faster economic growth also, even if the relationship not one-to-one, but on an average, they reduced MPI in relative sense a bit faster. Now, this trend line is population unweighted. I did not do population weighted, but we can also check for population weighted. For this particular analysis, I treated each state and their estimates individually, stands on its own. Now, which states have performed better than the national growth elasticity? Well, if you look at here, Himachal Pradesh, West Bengal, Goa, Jammu Kashmir, Manipur, Punjab, Meghalaya, Kerala, these are the states which have reduced MPI faster in relative sense. Whereas if you look at Gujarat, Bihar, Uttarakhand, Madhya Pradesh, these are the states that have reduced MPI in relative sense much slower vis-a-vis their own economic growth. I'll be presenting some further figures, and that will also show that how faster economic growth, even the national average, has not translated into faster poverty reduction, even in relative sense. I just took the opportunity, given that I presented state growth semi-elasticities and state growth elasticities, what about if we plot them in the same graph? Do we observe or do we get any insight out of it? Of course, we do not observe any relationship here because the slope coefficient is very low and it's statistically insignificant. What we observe here that there are examples of low, which means low state growth semi-elasticity. That means because of their growth, their reduction, absolute reduction is slower, as well as the relative reduction. So states like Gujarat, Uttarakhand had low absolute reduction as well as low relative reduction. State like Meghalaya has much faster absolute reduction as well as much faster relative reduction. Kerala, on the other hand, the size of these bubbles represent initial MPI in 2005-06, and you may see clearly that the size of the circle for Kerala is very small. That means to start with, Kerala already had a very low MPI. So of course, it could not reduce its MPI in absolute sense. But you can clearly see in relative sense, its reduction has been one of the fastest. Okay, So even starting with a much smaller MPI, its reduction has been much high compared to its initial level. Next, we move we still remain in vertical inclusiveness, but we show a particular decomposition where we decompose the elasticity into two components. And this component looks at first the elasticity of MPI with respect to national growth, but then breaks it down into an elasticity of MPI with respect to incidence, which says that percentage change in MPI owing to or related to 1% change in incidence of multidimensional poverty, and then further break down the incidence with respect to economic growth. Let's see what we observe from the figure. We can do the same thing for states. So in this particular figure, what we do on the vertical axis, we present the state incidence elasticity of state MPI, which is the percentage change in MPI associated with 1% change in the incidence. Now, at the beginning, I showed a decomposition where we presented MPI as a product of the incidence and intensity. And what is the usefulness of that particular decomposition? For that decomposition, the overall change in MPI, you can try to understand whether the overall change has been because of reducing the incidence of poverty or the intensity of poverty. If, for example, people who are very close to the poverty line, if the poverty reduction is due to a reduction in poverty among those who are very close to the poverty line, there will be a larger decrease in the incidence, but intensity will not change. So if we observe that the elasticity, that means percentage change in MPI, is faster than the percentage change in incidence, then we can infer that intensity has gone down much faster. However, if we see that in reduction in incidence, percentage change in incidence is same as the percentage change in MPI, then we have to understand that intensity did not change between a particular period. So what do we observe here? We have on the vertical axis, you can see this elasticity, that means percentage change in MPI due to 1% change in incidence, lies between 1 and 1.5. So for all states, if we look at relative reduction in MPI, that has been faster than the relative reduction in incidence. So it did not happen for any state that intensity has gone up between this period. Okay. Now let's focus on the states of, so this is the decomposition, the multiplicative decomposition. Now let's focus on these particular two states, which is Bihar and Jharkhand. Clearly, the state incidence elasticity of state MPI is around 1.5, which means that relative reduction in MPI is much faster than the relative reduction in the incidence, which means in those two states, you can see that the state growth elasticity of state incidence may not be as fast as in other states, but these two states must have reduced its intensity much faster. As a result, relative reduction in MPI has been much faster than its relative reduction in incidence. So these two states have done very well in terms of reducing its intensity much faster. Okay, now let's move on to horizontal inclusiveness. By horizontal inclusiveness, we mean how much of the national growth has been attributed to reduction in state MPI. So far, we were looking at the relationship of each state's growth to its own MPI reduction. Now we are going to link the national growth, how much it has been associated with different states' MPI reduction. And the main tool that we'll be using here for semi-elasticity, we'll be using the national growth semi-elasticity of subgroup MPI. And also, we'll show you a particular decomposition, which will also use the subgroup growth semi-elasticity of subgroup MPI. And similarly, we could use the national formulations. And here is the particular term that we'll be using in decompositions, which is the national growth elasticity of subgroup growth. Now, how are they all related? Turns out that a relationship between states MPI reduction to national growth is related by these two components. So first we look at how much is the relationship between national growth and the state growth. Is it the case that a particular state grew faster than the national growth? Okay, so this is percentage change in state growth due to 1% national growth. And then the other component is percentage change in MPI of the state with respect to 1% state growth. So what we are doing, the relationship between state MPI reduction and national growth, we are breaking it down to a relationship between national growth to state growth, and then how much of the state growth is related to these state MPI reduction. Similarly, this is for semi-elasticity. Similar formulation can be done for the elasticity, which is a relative change. So what do we observe here? So we break it down into, this is the semi-elasticity for, this is the change in MPI due to the state's growth. And then here on the horizontal axis, we present how much of the national growth is related to the state growth. And here is the national figure. Now what we do, we are going to divide them into certain quadrants. Okay, so these vertical line here, it says that, along this vertical line, it says that those states which has the same economic growth rate as the national growth rate. So the left of this vertical line are states which has much slower growth than the national growth. On the right side are states which has much faster growth than the national growth. This horizontal line, this one represents the national semi-elasticity of national semi-elasticity of growth to MPI, which shows the relationship between national MPI reduction, absolute reduction, and national growth. So if you go above this line, then the state growth semi-elasticity has been faster. If you are below this line, then state growth elasticity has been slower. If we look at distortant, that means here, which is the left and above, here are states which grew much slower than the national average, but their MPI reduction was faster than the national average. So although these set of states, economic growth did not share much of the national average, they did a very good job in terms of translating their economic growth, slower economic growth, to faster MPI reduction. States would be West Bengal, and then Jharkhand over here, okay? Then we have J&K, Jammu and Kashmir, and so on. Then we have Orthant 2. You can see some states that grew faster than the national average and also reduced MPI faster in absolute sense. And then in Orthant 3, there are states, group of states, which grew faster than the national average, but their absolute MPI reduction was much slower than the national average. And states included, again, Gujarat, Uttarakhand, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, Kerala, and so on. Now, these are absolute reduction. So you could argue, well, some states already had lower poverty, so they could not reduce it any faster. Fine. So we look at the relative reduction in MPI. So we have on the vertical axis, we have state growth elasticity of state MPI. And on the horizontal axis, we still have the same, which is national growth elasticity of state growth. And again, we divide the region into four sub-regions. This is Orthant 1, which means here, these are the set of states which grew slower than the national average, but reduced MPI faster in relative sense than the national average. And again, West Bengal, Punjab, Goa, okay. This is Meghalaya and Manipur. Then we have a set of states in Orthant 2, which grew faster and also reduced MPI faster, states such as Tamil Nadu. Again, they were slower in terms of reducing absolute poverty, but when we look at the relative poverty reduction, looks like they are faster. Here is Delhi, here is Kerala, much faster than the national reduction in terms of relative sense. And then we have the states in Orthant 3, again, Gujarat, Uttarakhand, Bihar falls in this region as well in terms of relative poverty reduction. But you can see these states grew faster than the national average, but in terms of multidimensional poverty reduction during this period, in relative sense, they were much slower. Okay. So if we look at Gujarat and Uttarakhand, then looks like these states have reduced multidimensional poverty much slower, both in absolute and relative sense, despite growing much faster than the national average. Finally, we looked at what is called dimensional inclusiveness, and the idea is to look at which of these 10 indicators that were part of the Multidimensional Poverty Index grew faster or grew slower. And we use some of these tools, such as national MPI elasticity of D8 sensitive headcount ratio. This first one requires first one measures the reduction in relative reduction in sensitive headcount ratio due to 1% reduction in MPI. That sort of shows which of these indicators grew faster relatively than the overall MPI. We also look at national growth elasticity of the sensitive headcount ratios, which shows how much of these economic growth has translated or related to these reduction in the MPI's components. And then we will also show a kind of decomposition that will help us to explain a little bit. The objective is to be able to explain that which indicators were a result of reduction in the overall MPI versus the indicators that actually led to the reduction in MPI. Okay, to understand, trying to understand that reduction mechanism slightly better. And here I present some of the figures. So here we have the 10 indicators of MPI. And the first column shows the relative change in census headcount ratios, and all these indicators have been ranked by these particular column. You can see assets, school attendance, electricity. These indicators had faster reduction in relative sense, whereas mortality, cooking fuel, housing, census headcount ratios fell much slower for these indicators. The next column shows the percentage change in uncensored headcount ratio. That means is just the uncensored headcount ratio of an indicator captures the deprivation rate or the proportion of population deprived, irrespective of deprivations in other indicators. So the first column presents the percentage change in census headcount ratio of an indicator divided by the percentage change in MPI. So due to 1% change in MPI or 1% change in MPI is associated with how much change in census headcount ratio for each indicator. Of course, the first 4 indicators grew faster or fell faster rather than the MPI. whereas the other 6 indicators, starting from nutrition, schooling, sanitation, mortality, cooking fuel, and housing, they grew slightly slower. Now, we also present the relationship between this relative reduction in census headcount ratio with national economic growth. Now, these two columns, the ranking in these two columns should be ordinally equivalent because this is just related to MPI. So this column is component of this column divided by relative change in MPI, and the component of this column is this change in relative change in census headcount ratio divided by economic growth. So they are ranking should be ordinarily equivalent in that sense. Now, what we do, as we did in one previous decomposition, we decompose. So this one is our, the first one is related to MPI, the second one is related to the economic growth, and then we break down this particular column, that means change in census headcount ratio due to 1% growth, into 2 further components. Okay, so first we observe in the final column, here it represents how much of the growth is associated with reduction in deprivation in an indicator. Okay, so if we look at assets indicator, for example, it shows that 1% of economic growth is it's related to 1.9% reduction in asset deprivation. Similarly, if we look at 1% economic growth is related to 1.89% reduction in school attendance. On the other hand, if we look at housing indicator, 1% of economic growth is related to only 0.33% reduction in deprivations of the housing indicator. Similarly, for cooking fuel indicator, it should be 0.39. It's very low as well. So here, these indicators grew much faster than economic growth, whereas the other indicators grew much slower than the economic growth. Now, let us look at next the relationship between a reduction in census headcount ratio and the uncensored headcount ratio. Now, what we find here that on aggregate, the economic growth is related to deprivations or reduction in deprivation, these indicators, the relationship is much stronger. So for the aggregate indicator, which is the uncensored deprivation in an indicator, there was much faster reduction, and those reduction may have also translated to reductions in the census headcount ratios. Okay. If we look at the indicators at the bottom of the table, it looks like owing to the economic growth, this set of indicators such as cooking fuel and housing did not register much faster reduction. So deprivations overall did not change as fast as the other indicators such as assets, attendance, and electricity. However, if we look at the percentage change in censored headcount ratios owing to or related to 1% change in uncensored headcount ratio, we observe a drastic reduction. That means with 1% reduction in the uncensored headcount ratio, the censored headcount ratio fell by nearly 3 times. So although the overall deprivation did not change, the censored headcount ratio or the deprivation among the poor has fell much faster than the overall deprivation. It seems this reduction in censored headcount ratio is because of the reduction in MPI rather than the reduction in itself. So we refer to the situation that deprive the distribution effect. So we define 2 terms. One is aggregate effect. That means the relationship between growth and the deprivation within that indicator. Okay. And then how much of that indicator is relates to reduction of deprivation among the poor. So what we try to, I mean, this is something we are still pondering. Suggestions are welcome in this regard. So for assets, attendance, and electricity, we try to argue that the aggregation effect is quite strong. That means there has been a much reduction in the indicator itself, which may have translated to reduction in or among the poor. Whereas cooking fuel and housing, in terms of their aggregate effect, there was not large reduction, much faster reduction in these indicators related to economic growth. But then if we look at the reduction, relative reduction among the poor versus the overall reduction, it's 3 times as large. And it looks like that because of the improvement in the joint distribution, that means all these indicators together are reducing the overall poverty figures, right? So their reduction in census headcount ratio probably is due to an improvement in the joint distribution. And so we refer to it as we are observing a very strong distributional effect. Now, before I go to the concluding section, I wanted to also show you a particular example of schooling versus the sanitation indicator. Now, for the schooling indicator, this particular elasticity is 0.95, whereas I cannot show you exactly. I don't know if you can see the the elasticity for sanitation, but it's much lower. Okay, it's around 0.45 or 0.5. Now, if we compare these two particular figures, you can see much larger relative reduction in schooling than sanitation. But when this deprivation, if you look at the change in the uncensored headcount ratio and censored headcount ratio fell much faster for sanitation than for schooling with respect to the uncensored headcount ratio. So we try to argue that there is stronger aggregation effect for schooling, but stronger distributional effect for sanitation, because sanitation, the change in the censored headcount ratio in sanitation is probably more related to improvement in the distribution. You can clearly see if you look at the change in the overall change in the censored headcount ratio, the relative change with respect to MPI or with respect to the national growth, they are very similar. But their compositions, these two compositions are quite different. So probably they can tell or they can narrate a slightly different story. How reduction in schooling and sanitation censored headcount ratios, how they are related to the overall reduction in MPI.
Okay, Suman, you got 3 minutes.
Yeah. Yes. Moving to concluding remarks now. So what we try to do, we try to fill a gap by exploring 3 different types of inclusiveness of economic growth in the Indian context. We first look at how the national growth translated into national MPI, and also how each state's growth translated into its own MPI deduction. We also look at the decomposition of these MPI reduction because of improvement in incidence versus improvement in intensity. Then we look at horizontal inclusiveness, which is how much the national growth has translated or is associated with states reduction in MPI. And we show that some states, despite their higher economic growth, did not see a much larger reduction in MPI, such as Gujarat and Uttarakhand. Dimensional inclusiveness. With dimensional inclusiveness, we try to understand, or again, using the elasticity formulations, sort of decipher how much of the effect is coming up from the improvement on the indicator itself versus how much has been caused by an improvement in the joint distribution, despite having not much improvement overall in that indicator. These proposed tools that we showed, of course, can be used in other countries to study inclusiveness of economic growth and sort of come up with a point estimate rather than just simply the regression-based estimate to see cross-country variation that can hide what is going on for each country as well as within countries. What we did not do and probably possibly could be done in future is looking at different regions' economic growth and how different regions, states within that region, say South Indian versus North Indian region, how each state has done within its own region to sort of capture some sort of neighborhood effect, which we have not done in these paper. I will stop here. Hopefully, I'm within time.
Thank you so much, Suman. I will turn it immediately over to Professor Chhibber.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. This is such a rich paper that I don't know where to start and where to end, but let me just, can you see the screen, please?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I don't know, you started off by saying India did well on growth and not so well on poverty reduction, etc. But, you know, I have a slightly nuanced view on this. I agree with you that India could do better, but, you know, I find these poverty line, $90 PPP, these are really very tricky, because if you look at the adjustment factors for countries, some of them don't make any sense to me. For example, the adjustment factor for Bangladesh is 0.39, and for India it's 0.27. You know, and Bangladesh is same as Serbia or Saudi Arabia. And since our chairman, James Foster, is now going to be on the World Bank's Global Commission on Poverty, he might want to take a look at some of those as well. You know, the other thing is that I did this table for a paper I wrote recently, and yes, India could do better, but you know, it's certainly not doing worse than Pakistan. And also, when you compare, you know, India with Nepal and Sri Lanka, I think it's better to have comparing apples with apples. I would compare Sri Lanka with Kerala, for example. I would compare Nepal with Uttarakhand or Himachal Pradesh. You know, otherwise the comparisons, at least to my mind, really don't you know, kind of add up. Like Pakistan, for example, you're saying it's got a very low poverty rate, but you know, what I looked at recently, when they changed the basket, the poverty rate in Pakistan is actually not as low as being shown in those numbers. But anyway, that's a minor point. I don't want to dwell too much on it. But I just wanted to say that, you know, India should improve, but it's not as bad as your starting points make out to be. I found the paper very rich in very interesting results. The huge variation across states. You know, the comparison you made between Gujarat and Haryana, etc. I used to have a saying in the old days. I actually wrote a short article on this, that if India could combine the growth of Gujarat with the social policies of Kerala, and there's a nice, very favorite sweet in India called Gajrela, which is a carrot halwa. I said, if you combine Gujarat and Kerala and make it into Gajrela, we would have the perfect outcome. I found also the huge variation across the characteristics, which you just ended on with, also very interesting, and I'll come back to it a little bit later. Although I would be very careful of drinking water numbers. I'm very suspicious of numbers on drinking water, because they basically bring one tap to a village, and then they say that this village has drinking water now, you know. And so those numbers need to be looked at more carefully. Now, what I tried to then think of is sort of, how could I add in my discussion to this, to your excellent paper? And I must say, I was looking for a little more information about the nature of deprivations by state. And perhaps this is in a bigger paper that Sabina already has, and therefore you felt not the need for it. But, you know, having just read this one paper, I was still looking for what's the deprivation in Haryana, and how is it different from Nagaland or Tamil Nadu, or, you know, and that's where the beauty of the MPI comes in, which the income poverty estimates can't tell us, which is, you know, and is it related in any way to anything that the state is doing, the particular state level schemes or flagship programs? This I felt missing, but I'll come back to this point. I also attended a very interesting lecture last week by somebody from Argentina, Maria, in which she had this presentation on inequality. And I felt maybe in a subsequent paper, you might want to bring that issue in addition to incidence and intensity, because, you know, if you think of, you know, I mean, I was the World Bank director in Turkey, and I had a beautiful project in the east of Turkey on watershed management. And that reduced poverty a lot. But then when an evaluation was done of that project, it found that the goat herders had now actually lost out, because once the land had been reclaimed for agriculture, then, you know, they had no place to go. So I think the issues of inequality are probably quite important for India, particularly with large number of, you know, pastoralists, scheduled tribes, you know, and all those issues that, and slum dweller issues. So I think you should bring some of that into it. Now, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to give you a very quick snapshot of a series of things I did to try to tease out a little more this inclusiveness that is the title of your paper. So here, of course, I look, for example, at, you know, how does the elasticity relate to the starting point? So if I start with the MPI of 2005-6, I find it's highly inversely related to the elasticity of the MPI to state income. I'll just quickly go through these and come back to them. Here again, I looked at the state income, the starting point of state income at 2014-15, and how does that relate to the elasticity of that state's income growth to the national income growth. And you see this very positive relationship, which means, you know, there's growing divergence in the country as well. This also shows the same thing, divergence, where the initial level of poverty is associated with very high poverty initially is negatively associated with the elasticity of MPI to state income. Now, I'm not a great statistician, so you may have been capturing some of this in some other way in your presentation, so please correct me. Here again, I looked at the elasticity of incidence to the initial level of state income. And you have richer states showing much higher elasticities of incidence to state income. Here I looked at, the intensity. And here you have a very interesting relationship. I mean, it's mostly negative. I haven't done, by the way, I haven't done all the statistical analysis around. I just picked from Excel the best fit on these. And so here you have it. You know, and again, higher state income. Okay, here, of course, you have in the case of intensity, you have the right relationship, but the richer the initial income of the state was, the lower the elasticity of intensity to income. Then I said, well, what are the other characteristics that could be driving some results? So I started looking at other indicators like the share of rural population in total in the state, and whether that was in any way related to elasticities. And here you have it with the incidence, and I don't think that's statistically significant, so there is no relationship there with rural income. Then I looked at, of course, intensity, and there you do have a relationship, that the higher the share of rural income, the higher the elasticity of intensity to income. Let me just try and finish all these, and then I'll come back to what it might mean. Then, of course, I looked at the share of the scheduled caste. India has the caste system, and then you have people classified into various castes. Of course, it's now been declared illegal, but the scheduled caste is a designation of people who are supposed to get special benefits by various schemes. So I looked at the share of scheduled caste population and how that might affect various elasticities. So here I look at the elasticity of MPI to state income against the share of SC population. And what's very interesting is that you have things at two ends. If the share is very low, the elasticity is very high. If the share is quite high, and this will, when I come to the tribal population, you'll see this more clearly. When the share is very high, again, you have high elasticities. But if the share is in the middle, like between 10 and 20%, you have much lower elasticities. Here I looked at the incidence, and again, you have the same parabolic type of, reverse polynomial distribution, which may, I'm just giving you these to show you what you might look at in future. Yeah, the intensity, I don't think this is really statistically significant, but you can see the relationship there as well, and perhaps tease it out more. The other category we have is tribal population. And here again, you see that the overall MPI to YM doesn't show much of a relationship. But when you break it down to incidence and then to intensity, you have the reverse here taking place in the case of intensity. And again, you see that if you're at the very low end or at the very high end, you have much lower elasticities, and in the middle, you have much higher. So states which have basically most of the population being tribal, these are the Northeast states, or states which have very low tribal population. Again, you have quite a big variation in your elasticities. So I just try to, what would be the normal sort of explanators for poverty reduction or lack of it, intensity versus incidence. And I just wanted to show you what I quickly was able to, using your data, basically come up with in teasing out, the nature of the inclusive process that's taking place here. Now here, since I didn't have the data on, the nature of deprivations, what you had given us was, of course, the, various elasticities that you just talked about at the tail end of your paper. So I said, let me see which is the state with the highest elasticity of the censored head count to MPI by the component of the MPI, right? And so these are the, you talked already about, the three components that have very high elasticities. But here I just did it by state to get an idea of what's happening in each state and which particular component is showing you the highest elasticities, just by way of getting some texture into the discussion here as well. And then, of course, you talked about this already in a different way, but I did plot the elasticity of the censored head count to the MPI, to the elasticity of the censored head count to the uncensored head count. And you clearly see a negative relationship, which you mentioned also, I think, there. And I mean, so there's a more systematic relationship there than your table was able to show. And I just wanted to point that out. And then if you look at the elasticity of uncensored headcount to income and the elasticity of censored headcount to uncensored headcount, again, you see this very sharp negative relationship there as well. This is much stronger, I think, and quite systematic across these components. So I think I would have liked, therefore, to have seen a much more textured discussion, perhaps it's for a future paper, on some of these components and which components are contributing to what in each state. And maybe you have that answer in your table, but and I haven't been able to fully get it. But anyway, I just thought I'd point out some of these things to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ajay. That's great. So, Suman, respond.
Absolutely. Fascinating what Ajay has prepared additionally. So, of course, this current paper, and you were absolutely right, Ajay. I mean, there is loads of things for future work. And this is actually what I had in mind, because this current paper was all about tables, data, and methodology. And I did not even have the opportunity to present the pictures, the relationship that I presented, there. And of course, I had that in mind for another future paper where we just go on the data. I mean, we have already developed the methodology in here, and it's used for data. So sort of responding to some of your comments. First, India is not as bad. It's look, yes, India has improved over the last 10 to 12 years. But still, we feel, yeah, you were right, probably in the sense we can tone down a bit, but still India has a long way to go. But of course, we can write it, and Sabina may come in, and if Sabina wants to respond to that particular issue. Incidence versus intensity, the kind of analysis you suggested. We have done some kind of work. Already I and Sabina used sort of worked on another paper called Inequality Among the Poor earlier, where we tried to analyze, how much incidence versus intensity works, and also bringing the component of inequality separately. So we have done some analysis, and of course, Mariama is leading the project afterwards, but I completely agree with you, looking at inequality, whether inequality between states in terms of reducing poverty, or inequality even within each state, is very important to look through. So absolutely, we didn't do it in this particular paper because the objective was slightly different in this paper, just to understand, present the methodology and look at the relationship between the overall economic growth and just multidimensional poverty. So we did not go to inequality in this particular paper in that sense. Divergence, absolutely spot on. So this is what we observed as well. We didn't present those data, but if we look at MPI reduction, what Sabina with Chris Oldiges and Usha Kanakaratnam, what they've observed, there was convergence in MPIs in terms of absolute sense. But when we look at the relative reduction in MPIs, we did not observe necessarily that, states with higher MPIs or had larger relative reduction. We actually have an appendix as well in the paper that we sent you, where it shows sort of the different relationship in relative poverty reduction. So if you look at relative convergence in that sense, no, actually relative divergence occurred, both in terms of state income and also a bit in terms of MPI reduction. What I like, Ajay, is your analysis in terms of linking the other social factors. the proportion of SCs, proportion of STs, and the other approaches that you have done. And I agree that could be another separate paper. Maybe this paper will become too large if I try to include all of those. But yes, I absolutely agree with you. There is food for thoughts about in other papers. Inverse relation between censored headcount and elasticity of components. Yes, I'm still trying to motivate that part. It's kind of, to me, it's still work in progress. We are still conceptually trying to think through how to present the concept better in that way. So in this paper, I did not go much deeper with the subnational level relationship, the one that you plotted. I found exact similar relationship at the national level. We first thought of putting it in the PowerPoint, then it was sort of a bit difficult to explain because we had to think it through a bit better. But that relationship, negative relationship, sort of existed. It could be a nice way of showing it, but in this paper, again, I did not go. I presented in an appendix all the figures, the elasticity figures at the subnational level, but in this paper, I just did not have the opportunity to go much deeper and present at the subnational level, but I completely accept your point. It would be interesting to see those relationships once we sort of clarify the theoretical side, the methodological side. It would be really interesting to look, to go deeper and look at the subnational relationship also for the censored headcount ratios for different subnational regions. For why we did not go for other social groups such as religious groups, caste group is we focused on subnational region because we had this average growth, and we could not decompose these per capita total income or GDP by social groups. So we could not observe that relationship directly. But as you showed, it is probably possible to look at them, although indirectly, at the state level by looking at their share of social group, even to show the relationship that if there is any descriptively, that would be ideal. So if I don't know if Sabina has something to add to your comments, but thank you so much, Ajay. It's very interesting.
Thank you very, very much, Ajay, and also Suman for the responses. I think in a methodological sense, what I really liked was pointing out the importance of somehow visibilizing the initial level. Because if we think of the initial level of poverty or of censored headcount ratios, that's in a sense the anchor. And I think one of the concerns I have with this paper, but I don't yet know, is that clearly, if you think of absolute change, it's easier for the countries or the subnational regions that have the highest initial deprivations. And in relative terms, it's the opposite. But does that mean that in the middle, that there's a group that is sort of disfavored, not perhaps because of their actual achievements, but because of how the numbers work and give priority or visibility or make it easier for the ends to make progress in relative or absolute terms? And so I think that's just a question, and there must be a literature on this, James. I'd love to hear from you in unidimensional space about the relative and the absolute and how they work together. But in terms of these elasticities, I think that that's a methodological question where the empirical findings are raising questions. And I think the other is as Suman said, clearly, I think that the findings are clear and easy to interpret with respect to economic growth. And I think although it's not causality, it's still somehow giving a shape of something that we understand. We also understand the censored and the uncensored headcount ratios. We have all of the details, and we could give you, as you said, the different compositions of poverty across the states. But maybe it's a question whether or not this approach makes it easier to interpret those patterns or not. So I think that, as Suman said, we're still thinking that through and would welcome input. Over.
Right. So the question is coming down to semi versus regular elasticity, and what does each measure, and is there something in between that would capture the middle more? I get that. I agree entirely that displaying all of this with reference to initial level can be extremely important. Because without it, I mean, the elasticity has initial level in it implicitly, but still the idea of knowing what it is that you're beginning with and then viewing the elasticity as the margin beyond that is, I think it's really important to always bear that in mind and not forget where you're starting off from. So how you incorporate this methodology so as to take that into account better, I don't know. How do you do the in-between? I don't know. But at least I can see that there's a hint that there's a way to move forward. So let's look forward in the future to see if maybe we all can work together to make clarity with respect to these growth elasticities in the context of multidimensional poverty. On that note, I will have to bring it to a close. We're really at time. So once again, for this season of seminars, thank you so much for joining us this time around. And we hope to see you after the break. Take care, everyone.